Salutations once again to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be around the planet. This is the 7th installment in Mythology 101, and the title is Detecting the Anomalies. I have a specific purpose in this talk, something that I want to accomplish with you. And it's not going to be easy to pull this off. So I call upon your patience and determination as we proceed. You'll see in the notes for this course, which you find on the visitors page on Nemeta, that I've made a bullet list of the essential elements of the Hebrew mythology, which you find in the Old Testament of the Bible, as well as in other Hebrew sacred writings, so-called, such as the Talmud, the Kabbalah, and the Zohar. I must warn you, however, that if you would seek to go and investigate those documents yourself, you find that they are concealed beneath a vast smokescreen of obscure terms. And the meaning that is to be found, for instance, in the Zohar is not by any means easy to access and almost impossible to access without the assistance of a Talmudic expert. And would a Talmudic expert assist you in the first place? Good question. I'll come back to that question about getting intel from Talmudic experts at some point along the way in these talks. But for right now, I want to invite you once again to stand before the table. We look down and we have in front of us, on the left, the Hebrew file, and on the right, the file that contains the Sophianic narrative. We haven't opened that file or looked into that file yet, but in the next talk, we'll do so. So what I'm going to do right now is slide that file on the right over to the other side of the table and put it aside for a moment. It's quite a large table. Oh, yes, it is. And I'm going to slide it way, way over, you could say, to the far right. And I'm going to leave it there for the moment. Now, remember that we have a stack of 40 files also next to the Hebrew file. And what I'm going to do is just pick 5 files out of those 40 and lay them out, so that we can compare what is in those files, in the racial mythology specific to each of those files, to what is to be found in the elements and components of the Hebrew myth, and in particular, the mythogen, that part of the myth that states the identity and purpose of the people who wrote it. Now, I have to advise you beforehand that were I to do this exercise properly, correctly, thoroughly, and at length, it would probably take a couple of hours. So what I'm actually going to do is give you, as far as possible, a summary overview of what is found in these other files as compared to the Hebrew file. This is comparative mythology in action. It actually takes years to do this kind of work. But in this case, we're going to do it in about 20 minutes. Obviously, the more files I take from the big stack, the longer this would take. So actually, I'm going to choose just 4, not 5. The Egyptian file of Irish mythology from the race, which is race specific to the Celtic peoples, Persian myth, which is race specific to the Aryan Caucasian rootstock of the Persians, and the Aztec file. Comparative mythology is a forensic art. So asking questions, as I've said before, is essential to working through the material. You have to go to it with a specific question to know what you're looking for. There's a saying I used in Mandela Effect Decoded. All the clues in the world don't count unless you know what crime has been committed. So obviously, if you're at a crime scene and it has been a kidnapping, a theft, or a murder, you have to know which crime you're investigating in order to read the clues correctly, right? Same thing here. What we're investigating is a crime against humanity. Does that ring any kind of bells for you? It has been said that the COVID-19 event is a crime against humanity. And in fact, that is the crime that we're investigating. But in this study, we go back to the origin of that crime, to the motivation behind that crime, and to the identification of the perpetrators that uniquely comes to light by the examination of this material. I have in front of me the bullet point list, and I advise you to pull up that page and look at it, or else print it out and keep it at hand. Elements of the Hebrew Biblical Semitic myth. That is the Hebrew file. El or Elyon, the supreme deity, also known as Yahweh, Yahweh, Jehovah. The Elohim, who are emanations of Elyon, a superspecies. Adam, the humanoid offspring of the Elohim, the Adamic race, which creates humanity. And tribally, this is the Yehudin. Eve, the terrestrial domain of Adam, which is identified with the promised land, known today as Israel. Enoshut, humanity itself, that is, all of the human races apart from the Adamic race, vulgarly known as the Goyim, the nations, or the Gentiles. And that is all in the beginning of the creation myth. Those are the elements at the foundation of the creation myth. Then there are some factors in the pre-flood scenario. Adam and Eve, assumed to be the primal parents of the human species, including all races. Cain and Abel, Seth, Noah, and that leads into the post-flood scenario of Noah, Abraham, Melchizedek, and so forth. Now the question is, do you find equivalence to these elements in other mythologies? These equivalents can be of two kinds. In the first place, they can be exact equivalents. So let's say there is a name of a deity in some mythology, Krishna in Hindu mythology, or the shamanic figure of Tezcatlipoca in Aztec mythology. And would you find in other racial myths the same entity with a different name? That's an exact equivalent. Secondly, there are simply parallel or correlative equivalents. For instance, in Aztec myth, there is a figure called Xochiquetzal. In Aztec mythology, which is actually, correctly speaking, the shamanic legend of the Aztec peoples, Xochiquetzal is a goddess figure known as the flower feather woman. And she is somewhat correlative to the figure of Venus in Roman mythology or Aphrodite in Greek mythology. But it's only a correlation. It's not an exact identification. In fact, there is another figure in Aztec myth, Ixpapalotl, the obsidian butterfly woman. And she could also qualify as a close correlation to the love and sex goddess, who is also a war goddess, Aphrodite. Now the question is, again, just asking for a friend, when the Aztecs said Xochiquetzal or Ixpapalotl, were they referring to the same entity as Aphrodite and other love goddesses that you could name, taken out of different files? For instance, the flower woman in Celtic mythology, or specifically Welsh, is Blodeuwedd, a woman whose body is said to be composed of 9 different flowers. When the ancient Welsh seers and poets evoked the name of Blodeuwedd, were they referring to the same entity as Aphrodite, Ixpapalotl, etc.? Or is there merely a parallel correlation, and not an exact identification? Now, I don't want to digress here because you can see we're taking on quite a big task in this talk. But it's imperative that I point out something to you. A vastly common error in the view of many uneducated people and many people of common faith when they come to this material. For instance, you most often hear it said that there is only one Creator God for all of us here on earth, for all races, all peoples. But different races and cultures give it a different name. So Yahweh is a name for the supreme deity, perhaps Allah, perhaps Brahma in the Hindu mythology, perhaps Amun in Egyptian mythology. And there is a current assumption, which is entirely wrong, that all of these different names actually refer to the same entity. So in fact, there is one fundamental and essential truth behind all religions and all religious mythologies, and that is entirely wrong. So I want to warn you off that as we proceed with this investigation. Now, what does it mean to detect the anomalies? Well, looking at the bullet point list for the Hebrew file, we want to see if there are any exact identifications between the entities named in that file and any other mythologies. And if there are, then those elements in the Hebrew file cannot be considered as anomalous. They would simply be variations or parallels with other mythological systems around the world. But if it so happens that we can't find direct and exact identifications for those factors, the conclusion is there are elements in the Hebrew file which are totally anomalous. Obviously, I can't go systematically through these other files and compare them point by point in every case, but let's proceed in a rather hit or miss fashion and see what turns out. Now, starting with the case of the supreme deity, El or Elyon, well, it's a vague designation, or at least it appears to be so. If that is the supreme deity of the ancient Hebrews, if it represents an actual divine or supernatural power or agency, then is it possible to identify the same entity by another name? Say, Ometeotl. Ometeotl is the supreme deity of the Aztecs. But when you look into the description of Ometeotl, you find something that immediately does not match with Elyon, Jehovah. You see, it is said that Ometeotl lives in a heaven realm. Omeokan. But wait a minute. According to Genesis, Elyon, who is not named, by the way, creates both the heaven and the earth. So where is Elyon? Where is Jehovah? He, and that is a distinctly male entity, the Father Creator God, is neither on earth nor in heaven. But Ometeotl is in the Aztec heaven, Omeokan. And continuing, when you look closer at the profile of this divine supernatural entity, something jumps out immediately. It is connected with the concept of duality. However, when you look at the supreme creator God of the Hebrew, there is no duality, is there? It is the single and supreme monotheistic creator God. So one thing you can characterize in the Hebrew file that is an anomaly is that it describes a male creator deity who acts without consort. Now, if you compare that element of evidence with the other files, you find that it is indeed an anomaly. For example, in Irish or Celtic myth, the possible equivalent to Jehovah, Yahweh, is called Dagda, or the Dagda. So that is the supreme father god of the Celtic peoples. But the Dagda is not alone. The Dagda has a consort known as Boann, which is actually the name of a river in Ireland north of Dublin. And next to that river, there is one of the world's most famous megalithic sites called Newgrange. And Newgrange is in fact designed in the form of a female uterus with an interior circular womb and a long uterine channel that is aligned to the rising of the sun at the winter solstice. And so Newgrange is a ceremonial megalithic site for celebrating the union of the Dagda, who is somewhat considered as a sky god or celestial god, with the river goddess or earth goddess, Boann. But you don't find anything like that in the foundations of the Hebrew file. Elyon stands alone beyond both heaven and earth. To emphasize this point, I'll cite you a few lines of Toltec poetry. I bet it's been a while since you've heard any of that. Now, this is from a marvelous book called Aztec Thought and Culture by Miguel León Portilla, and it is one of the best perhaps the best of all books on the subject. Leon Portilla really grasps the material profoundly and innately. By comparison, say, to another scholar in that field, Burr Cartwright Brundage, who doesn't have a clue to what he's talking about when he interprets Aztec mythology. But here are some lines cited by Leon Portilla from the Toltecs, from a manuscript describing the Toltecs. And the Toltecs knew that many are the heavens. They said there are 12 superimposed divisions. There dwells the true God and his consort. The celestial God is called the Lord of duality, and his consort is called the Lady of duality, the celestial lady. So what you will find, what you have here is a myth theme, as Eliade called it, a mythological theme, a myth theme that is constant and repeated endlessly through many mythologies. At the source of creation, there is a male and female pair of divinities. But you do not find this to be so with Yahweh, who is alone the male-only creator. Of course, in the Talmud, they say that Yahweh, whom they will not name, does have a consort. And that consort, they say, is the people of Israel. But that, again, is an anomaly in the Hebrew file. It's unique to that file. Now let's examine the mysterious Elohim. Are there any? These are the emanations of Elyon. Are there any equivalents to the Elohim in other mythologies? Well, again, this is difficult to determine, somewhat difficult, due to the general nature of the concept. The attention of the comparative mythologist immediately goes here to the notion of a pantheon of gods. So, for instance, in Greek mythology, there is the supreme father god Zeus. Is he comparable to Yahweh? No, because Zeus has a consort, Hera. And around Zeus and Hera, who are, as it were, the king and queens of heaven, there is a pantheon, usually of 12 deities. You find the pattern of 12 in the Aztec myth as well. So are the 12 deities in this universal pattern to be identified with the Elohim? Look at Egyptian mythology. In fact, you have to take a long, hard look, because there are 3 different pantheons of gods in Egyptian mythology. There is the Theban pantheon from Upper Egypt. There is the pantheon of Heliopolis from the area of the pyramids. And then there is a third pantheon of gods from Hermopolis. So if you examine these pantheons of gods, which are in groups of 8, 12, and otherwise, can you say that they represent parallels in some way to the Elohim? Well, it's inconclusive. You can't actually say that. It would be careless to equate them on the basis that there is a loose resemblance. That being so, it leads to the conclusion, the investigation leads to a tentative conclusion that there must be something odd or anomalous about the Elohim. Now let's look at Adam. Well, Adam is the first man in the jargon of comparative mythology. And of course, there are many other designations of the first man. Ymir in Nordic mythology, of the Finnish Kalevala, Gaiomart in Persian mythology, and so forth. By the way, in Persian myth, which comes down to us from the ancient Avestan language of the Aryan Caucasian rootstock, in that myth there is also a pantheon of entities called the Amenshaspentas, and they are a group, a hierarchy of supernatural beings around the central figure of Ahura Mazda. But once again, to return to the question of duality, which I already raised, in Persian mythology, and particularly in Zoroastrianism, which I don't follow, by the way, the mythology states that there's a primal duality in the cosmos beyond the human level. There is Ahura Mazda, the good god, and there is Ahriman, the bad god. So that is the split at the source of creation, which is unique to Zoroastrian myth. But once again, it shows that there is duality in the foundation of the myth. The Hebrew file, however, presents a strong statement for a non-dual monotheistic entity. Well, back to Adam, the primal man. Well, let's recall, and I'll provide you with some research material on this point taken directly from Talmudic experts. To those who wrote the script, the Hebrew, Adam does not mean the parent of the human races. It means themselves. It is a self-referential term. But when we look elsewhere for the primal man, Gayamart, or say Purusha in Hindu myth, that's a correlation, but again, it's not a direct identification. And additionally, the factor of duality comes into play in all these other mythological files, but it is excluded in the Hebrew file. That is the first striking anomaly. So, if you take Purusha to mean the primal man in Hindu mythology, he is always coupled with Prakriti, which represents the primal female. But you don't find that dualistic proposition in the Semitic myth we are examining. All right, 2 more points of comparison before this investigation drags on too long. Enoshut. Now, Enoshut is the Talmudic word for all of the human races, exclusive of the Hebrew. And it's an interesting exercise to go into a Bible search engine on the internet and try to find the word humanity in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. You don't really have much luck on that. Why not? Because humanity is introduced in Genesis, and I cite the passage, you'll find it in the notes. I think it's Genesis 27. And it's introduced in that famous line, and he created man, or humanity, Adam, but it doesn't mean humanity. So from the very beginning, the Hebrew myth, the mythogen, provides you with a false clue, and it misleads you from the very start. Now you might ask the question, do you find in any other of these 40 files, Japanese, Polynesian, Slavic, Incan, the varieties of Native American Indian mythology and folklore, Greek, Roman, Phoenician, Sumerian, which is distinct from Semitic, by the way. The Sumerians did not speak the Semitic languages. The Assyrians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians did not speak the Semitic languages. Do you find in any of that Sumerian mythology in the way that the myth is preserved, something that intentionally misleads you from the moment that you set eyes on it? I assure you, no, you don't. There is no intention to mislead you in all of these other mythological scenarios. And that is perhaps the outstanding anomaly to be detected as we investigate the Hebrew file. So moving now on from Adam, let's go to that intriguing figure of a clone-like entity who has neither father nor mother, without generation, Melchizedek. Now, as you know, Melchizedek plays a tremendously important role, a key role, in the self-written legend of the ancient Hebrews, because it is Melchizedek, the perfect simulacrum of a human being, who comes as the emissary of Elyon to Abraham and gives him the mission of his people. So there you have that element, the mission, the second element of the mythogen. The mission comes from Melchizedek. So when you look at the figure of Melchizedek in the Old Testament, and you find him mentioned again in the New Testament, where Paul or Saul of Tarsus states specifically that Melchizedek is the power behind the Messiah, Jesus Christ. When you look at Melchizedek closely in the Hebrew file, and then cast your eyes across these other files, do you find the equivalent of Melchizedek? Or, even better, do you find the exact identity under a different name? Once again, you proceed with a leading question. What you're going to find depends on the accuracy and pertinence of the question, because all the clues in the world don't count if you don't know what crime has been committed. Now, it helps to use another tool here, to take another tool out of the toolbox of comparative mythology. There is a typology that you can apply all across racial myths. So there is a type that appears in many different variations. In Hindu mythology, the name for this type is the Manu, M-A-N-U. And the Manu is a guide to the peoples. Quite simply that. Well, obviously, Melchizedek fits this type, doesn't it? Yes. So what other similar types, parallel types, can you find that might compare to Melchizedek? Certainly, the first that comes to mind, or at least to my mind anyway, you know how that works, is Viracocha. Now, Viracocha is a widely known figure in South American mythology, and it represents a mysterious figure who happens to be white, dresses in white, often portrayed as a bearded white man. And Viracocha, sometimes associated with Lake Titicaca, it appeared among the South American peoples as a teacher and guide. Now, there is a strain of New Age mythology which relates Viracocha, or the lineage of teachers and guides he represents, as being survivors of Atlantis. So there's a link into Atlantean mythology, which is a very swampy area. And I'm not going to go there because I lost my swamp boots last week. But seriously, Viracocha is a perfect archetype of the Manu. Other names for the Manu are the folk hero. And of course, you find hundreds of folk heroes in these different mythological files. For instance, specific to the Incas, by comparison to the Aztecs, is Manco Tupac. That is the name of the Viracocha figure among the Incans. Among the Sumerians, who were non-Semitic, you find Enki. And you also find Oannes, who was a mysterious figure who appeared out of the sea, out of the Persian Gulf, to be precise. And it is typical of all of these figures that they do resemble Melchizedek in that they just seem to come out of nowhere. But they are never represented as being without generation and being of no parentage. As a matter of fact, they always have some kind of lineage behind them, generally a human / superhuman lineage. So they are typically represented as godlike figures who appear among the peoples and the races in order to teach and guide them. Hence, Enki and his brother Enlil. In Egyptian myth, the Viracocha figure is represented by a group called the followers of Horus. And it is, in fact, the so-called followers of the falcon god Horus who founded the temple of Dendera, which is the birthplace of Isis, and the sacred sanctuary of the Egyptian mother goddess Hathor. In Chinese mythology, I'm jumping around here, you find the figure of Fuhi, Fuhsi. And Fuhi is like a shaggy sage who comes out of the wilderness. He is credited with discovering the patterns of the 6 hexagrams of the I Ching on the back of a turtle. Well, what is the I Ching? It is a paradigm of moral and civic order. So Chinese society was based on the ethics and the guiding principles of the I Ching. So the Manu, for example, Fuhi, brings such things to the people to help them live in the right way and live in harmony and correctness with each other. Melchizedek doesn't do that. Melchizedek does not bring guidance to the peoples of Sumeria who are non-Semitic. He doesn't bring guidance to the totality of humanity. He only brings a specific mission to a specific ethnic group of the Armenoid race living in the Middle East, speaking the Semitic languages. And this event happens just about 3,800 years ago, if you want to place it in the historical record. Well, recall I said I'd cover this material in 20 minutes, and we're now heading for 40. So I'm going to bring this talk to a close. I will cite, however, a couple of other examples of Manu figures or folk heroes who mysteriously appear to teach the people how to live. For instance, in Nordic or Scandinavian mythology, you have the figure of Odin. Now, Odin is kind of a father god figure, and he's often identified as a god, but Odin is not a god. Odin is, in fact, a shaman. Now, Odin undergoes a shamanic ordeal. He hangs for 9 days and 9 nights on the sacred tree. This is a mythological theme. There is a sacred tree in Genesis, too. There are 2 trees, the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. So the sacred tree theme also appears in the Hebrew file, but again, by close examination, it has anomalous factors. So Odin is a shamanic teacher when he acquired the runes through his ordeal of initiation, he then brought these runes from the realm of the Nahual, or the supernatural, into the realm of the Tonal, or culture, and the runes become magic spells or guiding principles for the people. This is the typical behavior of a Manu or folk hero. In Hindu mythology, there are dozens of Manus. Prajapati, Vishvavata, there are whole lineages of Manus in the Hindu Vedic mythology. So you see, in summary, there are many elements in these other files that could be considered initially, provisionally, as parallel or correlative to the basic elements of the Hebrew file. But on closer examination, it proves not to be the case. This investigation so far leads to a very great question. Well, if we cannot identify exactly who Elyon is, or the Elohim, or the Adamic race, or Melchizedek, by comparing with these other files, even though we can determine that those are anomalous mythological figures, how can we identify them? Is there any other mythology that tells us who these figures in Hebrew mythology actually are? Well, I bet you're wondering about the file that I slid across the table over there to the far right, aren't you? Good guess. And in the next talk, the time comes to open that file and see what it tells us. Enough said. And I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.